We're back with another top 10 strongest list, this time for Gen 4. This is a really important generation for a lot of people from a competitive perspective, as it was when a lot of people started really seeing what it was all about with the advent of being able to play with folks online. It was also when online resources for competitive battling really became a staple in the fandom more than it had ever been to that point. I think a lot of fans can probably recall a personal experience really discovering sites like Smogon back in the late 2000s or the very early 2010s. It also helps that, at least in my opinion, Gen 4 is one of the best generations competitively too. And if you're new to these lists, then I'll clarify now that these lists come mostly from a competitive standpoint, mostly in the context of play in the overused tier. That means that Uber tier Pokemon are banned from this list, which would include most of the big legendaries like Mewtwo, Rayquaza, and Dialga. Obviously, Arceus won't be making this list either. But Uber tier list isn't just legendaries. Fan favorite Garchomp is also banned to Ubers in this generation, so it won't be making this list either because it's just too strong in standard play. Now, without further ado, let's get right to the list. Number 10 is always a painful one to start off with, but ultimately I settled on Lucario for the number 10 spot. It feels cliché to start off a Gen 4 list with Lucario, especially when Pokemon from other regions like Gyarados are about equal with it. But I'm comfortable with my pick here. Lucario is iconic in Gen 4, and it's one of the best offensive Pokemon in the game and made a really striking first impression. It was immediately a very powerful choice with fans when the game was new, even outside competitive. And over 10 years later, it stuck around as a fan favorite. The type combo is pretty good, and allows it to overcome some of the more annoying things about the Gen 4 meta, like Toxic Spikes and Stealth Rock, making it rise above some of the other choices I was originally going to put in this spot. It also has excellent attack stats and decent speed, a combo you can never go wrong with as an attacker. It also has plenty of good moveset options, though most enjoy a Swords Dance set, and many sets use close combat and extreme speed, two moves that are pretty commonly associated with Lucario because of Gen 4. Unlike Gyarados, Lucario isn't always the easiest to figure out how to counter in the middle of a match too, though I think Gyarados ends up being a little easier to set up as a sweeper earlier in matches, while Lucario is more of a revenge late game sweeper. But Lucario has many ways to be played with, which include it being an opener to break through defenses early, and even teaming with fellow offense monster Gyarados to wear the opponent down to the point of no return. Overall, it's still one of the top choices in OU, just like when the game was first released. At number 9 comes perhaps a controversial entry, a Pokemon that's accepted as very good and competitive, but maybe not quite top 10 in the eyes of some. It's Rotom. In Gen 4, Rotom's typing doesn't actually change with its form. It's always Electric Ghost, so it doesn't need to sacrifice this excellent type combo for its increase in power. That's not to say all the type combos it gets later are bad, but being able to retain such a great typing in Ghost Electric with those superior stats works very well here. For example, spin blocking is still a pretty big deal in Gen 4, and Rotom is one of the best examples of those with its Ghost typing. Levitate also stops Earthquake, which is a huge deal as an electric type. It also gets a lot of approaches due to all of its alternate forms being viable, except the fan form, which doesn't really get anything to make it worth it in Gen 4. These options are one of the reasons it's so high, though ultimately, I think Heat and Wash forms are the way to go, which doesn't change too much going into later generations. The move pool choices are just too solid, though the Mowing form definitely has some powerful niche uses with Leaf Storm, as the strong grass coverage is very good against some of the major threats in the OU tier. Rotom would be even better if it had an actual HP stat, but unfortunately, even its excellent defense doesn't really fix that base 50 HP. But at the end of the day, it's another Pokemon introduced in Sinnoh that made a lasting impression in this series, and a great example of making a fun, unique gimmick Pokemon without having it feel like it was contributing massively to the power creep that would slowly rear its head in the series. Next up, we have another entry that I suspect some will find controversial, Clefable. In a metagame where hazards and periodic damage can run amok and draw the ire of players, Clefable rises with its Magic Guard ability and is a total game changer. It looks like a Pokemon that would be simple to just swap in and attack directly, but it's a little tough to counter in high level play if you don't have the right team. The reason I would consider this controversial is that some players that played Gen 4 competitive when it was the most recent game in the series may not be overly all familiar with Clefable being considered this good, especially since Blissey used to be more common. Or if you're someone that's currently really into Gen 4 competitive, then you're likely to think this placement is too low for Clefable. It's not uncommon to see Clefable considered top 5 these days, as its usage has shot way up. Its resurgence in the Gen 4 OU meta still feels a little fresh to me though, and it does get countered by fighting and ghost types well enough in spite of its excellent movesets and general utility. But ultimately, Clefable with its Magic Guard ability has become this incredible stall breaker in the meta, or can choose to use its own stall strategies in return. It has access to Wish, Protect, Stealth Rock, Soft Boiled, Seismic Toss, Knockoff, and a lot of coverage options. It's just the right package for it to be able to compete despite not having great stats. If you don't believe me when I say Clefable has risen to become at least a top 10 Pokemon in DPP, go look up some matches and usage stats in more recent years. It's the real deal. Flygon makes our number 7 spot, and this one is a lot more simple than the previous entries. Our friend here has a solid ground dragon dual typing, and a solid move pool to accompany a nice stat spread. And its most effective moveset options are surprisingly obvious. Stab Earthquake, Stab Outrage, Coverage, and maybe some recovery with Roost. And yeah, I'd be doing you a disservice by trying to overcomplicate explaining why Flygon is so good. It's easy to fit in your team and strategize around, has some good choice band or scarf options, and while it has a few counters, even a lot of its counters dislike switching into it. Its biggest fear is getting hit by anything ice related, especially if it's a bulky Pokemon like Swampert switching in with it. The fact that some Pokemon may specifically try to take up a move slot with an ice move just because of Pokemon like this does speak for itself though. Flygon is just an easy top tier Pokemon in Gen 4 that fits right into the meta, and has been a favorite to use by many in DPP competitive for a very long time. At number 6, it's our first legendary Pokemon on the list, Heatran. A legendary that isn't banned to Ubers. And more importantly, Heatran is the first fire type to actually make one of my top 10 strongest lists for a generation. Yeah, I've mentioned Pokemon like Entei and Charizard in honorable mentions, but I never really came close to considering a fire type to actually be on the list, because they're kind of hard to sell at the highest level of play in these earlier generations. And now that I think about it, Lucario is the first fighting type to make one of these lists too. I never really thought about how well the generation was able to catch certain things up competitively compared to what came before it. Anyway, Fire Steel type makes the most of its 600 base stat total, with excellent defenses and a near unparalleled 130 special attack. I could just end the entry right there quite frankly, because it speaks for itself. But it's not just the stats, it's the insane amount of movesets you can use. Life Orb sets, Choice Band sets, there's even a crazy Metal Sound option that's seen success in play. You'd think it'd be more like Flygon and have a smaller but very efficient set of options. But there's so much you can do with Heatran, and they're usually very aggressive options too. And that's all while being very tanky. Its main counters are bulky Pokemon that can hit back with a typing weakness, specifically Ground. It's another Pokemon where I usually think of Swampert as its worst enemy. And from here on out, Heatran would stick around in the OU meta in this series for a very long time. Starting off our top 5 is Breloom, a Pokemon that was already great in the previous generation, but is even better here. It fits on almost every team. And while that 460 base stat total isn't great, the fact that it has 130 physical attack is unreal in Gen 4. As with the physical special attack split, Breloom can pop off with both stab fighting and grass attacks, and it has the move options to ensure that it's threatening beyond just its attack stat. It's also the most iconic Spore user in the game. The fact that it's so strong and you're also at risk of being put to sleep is very scary. It's a total nightmare to switch into Breloom. Its main problems are its other stats. Poor base defense and speed prevent this thing from being totally broken. It's also got a lot of typing weaknesses as well, though they're not all super common as coverage options at least, but it's still enough to be a problem. Needless to say, it's Breloom, and it's been proven to be top 5 material time and time again despite its flaws. Because of these flaws, it's not uncommon to see Choice Scarf or Focus Sash as held items on the most offensive early game Brelooms, which I think is one of the best ways to start a match, especially if you're using the Spore Effect ability along with it. Otherwise, Toxic Orb is the most common along with the Poison Heal ability, and it's not hard to see why, and it makes you immune to status effects and will heal you every turn. Overall, if you're not familiar, you may be surprised to see it in the top 5. But not only is Breloom worthy of being this high, but it would continue to be an excellent Pokemon in future generations, just like Heatran. Number 4 is our obligatory Skarmory entry. Welcome back. Still an excellent physical tank, still an amazing typing, and still an amazing spikes user. It's not quite as dominant as it was in Gen 3, thanks to a few new Pokemon that can appear in the meta, and certain Pokemon just benefiting a little more. Yet it's still this high. You're probably sick of Skarmory at this point, so I won't say too much more. I will say, however, that it's interesting that since its introduction in Generation 2, some of its movesets don't feel entirely different, despite the meta being totally different from Gold, Silver, and Crystal. The main difference is that it couldn't use spikes in Gen 2, but we already covered that in the last entry. The counters I usually think of are really powerful Choice Scarf users that can chunk away through its defenses, and the newly introduced Magnezone with its good typing counter and magnet pull ability. But despite new counters, like the previous entries, Skarmory is here to stick around in the OU tier for a long time. The mighty top 3 starts off with another legendary Pokemon. This one was stuck in the Uber tier in Gen 3, but making its debut in OU in Gen 4 is Latias. It's another one with 600 base stat total, with 110 speed, 110 special attack, and 130 special defense being the obvious standouts, and being very ideal overall. The Dragon Psychic type is also very unique, with weaknesses that aren't super common, and thankfully, it's also a dragon that doesn't have a 4 times weakness to something too. It also gets an insane amount of moveset options that can either be defensive or offensive. Since it boasts Draco Meteor and excellent special attack, it can go Choice Specs or Choice Scarf and just immediately wreak havoc. You can pair it up with Dragon Pulse if you want something that won't lower your stats in the process, or Hidden Power Fire. Since there are some pesky steel types in this tier that will annoy Latias, you'll likely find it worth it a decent amount of the time. There are a ton of sets you can look up just to see how versatile Latias is offensively. When thinking of checks, most players will say Clefable and Blissey thanks to their own moveset options being annoying and being able to tank special attacks. But when I think of Latias counters, I think of the next entry on our list. You're about to notice a trend here, because at number 2, we have another familiar Pokemon, Tyranitar, our number 1 pick from the Gen 3 list. Some Pokemon just stay on top for a long time. Tyranitar. Its reason for being such a staple and overused is similar to Gen 3, but under more modern sensibilities. It still has Sandstream, insane stats minus its speed, and a unique typing that allows it to counter some of the tier's best Pokemon, especially Latias. It's also not hard to figure out how to fit it in your team and to use it in general. It's basically a big kaiju monster that you send out there to cause damage. And with its incredible move pool options, it's yet another Pokemon with a ton of set options, just like in Gen 3. Though the first thing I tend to think of with Tyranitar is its stab pursuit trapping. Stealth Rocks too, of course. Something I've seen used with it, but it's not as common as you may think it is on this Pokemon, despite this generation being infamous for introducing the move. Its counters are more prominent here than the previous generation, however, with Lucario, Breloom, and Machamp in particular being more than willing to rise to the challenge of facing it. But even with that, Tyranitar is still so important to the meta and has the potential to be an excellent teammate or powerful sweeper. Unfortunately, those familiar with the Gen 4 meta in 2023 knew this was coming from the start, and they know what's coming next too. But before heading to number 1, some honorable mentions. Swampert, which was pretty close to making the top 10, is still good for similar reasons to Gen 3. In fact, it was so good that I mistakenly said it was the first water ground type in the last video because of the impact it made. Sorry, Quagsire. Gyarados, an excellent sweeper and pretty iconic in the Gen 4 meta. Every one of these videos has what is basically a number 11 pick for me. And as you could probably tell, it was Gyarados today. Metagross, another one that could have easily made the top 10, though it's got a ton of options, I personally like it as a Stealth Rock user. Machamp, a popular one in DPP, yet also kind of underrated. The no-guard ability with Dynamic Punch is seriously awesome, even outside of competitive. Dragonite, another really popular choice. Its high physical attack really comes into play with the physical special split here. It's a common victim of Stealth Rock and Ice attacks though. Empoleon, probably the best of the Sinnoh starters in OU, though Infernape is also pretty good as well. Magnezone is a Pokemon I mentioned earlier, and yeah, it's great. Magnapult was already really good on Magneton, and it's of course even better on its new evolution. Its special attack being base 130 is also pretty damn good, but it being a Steel Trapper is where it makes its name. Other honorable mentions include Zapdos, Gliscor, Starmie, Kingdra, Roserade, Hippowdon, Scizor, Azelf, Blissey, Milotic, Bronzong, and Suicune. And at our top spot, it's Jirachi. Like our previous number 1 entries, it won't take long for you to realize that it's a pretty unanimous choice as a number 1 in Gen 4 outside of Ubers, though perhaps not quite as unanimous as Tyranitar in Gen 3 or Tauros in Gen 1, and definitely not Snorlax in Gen 2. But still, it's commonly accepted as the best in Gen 4 competitive. It's powerful, versatile, and features an excellent typing with an excellent ability. Not much has changed with Jirachi going in the Gen 4. Wish plus Calm Mind and Choice Scarf sets are pretty common, but I personally like the Superachi set, which is essentially an offensive approach using Calm Mind that can handle the Pokemon that would normally counter it by having an extra coverage attack over recovery. Because Jirachi has so many different approaches with its move options, it means it's probably the hardest Pokemon in the meta to counter consistently. You never know what your opponent's Jirachi strategy is going to be or what coverages it will have. My favorite check for it is probably Magnezone, because it feels more consistent than most other options. But it will really depend on what moveset Jirachi is using. But even with something like that around, Jirachi is still ultimately considered the strongest Pokemon in Gen 4 OU. And those are the top 10 strongest Pokemon in Gen 4. DPP didn't shake up a few parts of the top as much as I thought it would way back when I imagined this list before I started this series, despite more obvious seeds of power creep starting to pop up. But thankfully, for those of you that want to see fresh blood, Gen 5 is next. And a top 10 for Black and White from a competitive point of view is inevitably going to be very different from the last 2 generations. Well, for the most part. This was definitely not super easy for me to finalize, as a few Pokemon here definitely wouldn't have been this high 15 years ago. But even for these old generations, the meta continues to evolve, and it's interesting to revisit them and see how certain team strategies may have changed. So, did anything in the top 10 surprise you? What does your top 10 look like? How do you feel about the Gen 4 meta in hindsight? Do you like it more than Gen 3? Let me know down below. We're finally here in 2023, and I'm super excited for what this year has to offer us. There's potential DLC for Scarlet and Violet on the horizon, and who knows just what else Game Freak may have up their sleeves. It's gonna be really exciting times coming up for a Pokemon fan. If you're interested in more Mystic content, check out my TikTok and Mystic Umbreon Shorts YouTube channel. I've got a really fun series starting up there very soon, and of course, have a weekly edition of my Should You Use series focusing on Pokemon in Scarlet and Violet. Also, if you're into fanfictions and what ifs, check out Mystic Reads. I offer a ton of creative spoken word content on there, so come join me. Thanks again for joining me today, and I'll see you all next time.